Ladies and gentlemen, what would you do if you were the president of a country, were basically fired for being a grafting bastard, and basically you live in a palace built by the taxpayers of South Africa? Would you just quietly quit like President Cyril Ramaphosa, or would you put in a land claim for the entire nation of South Africa? Well, if you are Jacob Zuma, you would do the latter, because according to him, the Bantus arrived here in 500 AD and they lived peacefully, and there was Wakanda and there were universities and everything was going swimmingly until that bastard Jan van Riebeeck arrived in 1652, and therefore, according to him, we must reverse everything that has happened since Jan van Riebeeck arrived. I think it's a very strong argument as to why Jacob Zuma is a moron.
Yeah, I mean, this is really weird. Like, most of the history books seem to say the English and the Dutch were in the south of the country in around the 17th/18th century. The Bantus were in the Congo region. The Bantus marched south in order to gain territory. White settlers, if you want to call them that, marched north in order to gain minerals, and they met in the middle and had Rorke's Drift and all sorts of other little palavers. So what Jacob Zuma argues is that we should give Wakanda back to all of the local indigenous black people that have been here for centuries, and if we drive out the original sin of Jan van Riebeeck coming there and expropriating all of their property, then everything will go back to Wakanda.
I mean, it would be nice if he used real history. Like, he claims that the Bantu expansion happened in 500 AD, which is bullshit. It happened in the 18th century at the earliest. And number two, he says everything was great until Van Riebeeck arrived, right? Except, you know what is wrong with this sort of thinking is that, especially for the ANC, that they can't reconcile two things properly, right? Number one, they say everything that happens is Jan van Riebeeck is wrong and immoral and essentially slavery. But when they are in power, they're quite happy to use the very institutions created by Jan van Riebeeck's descendants to enhance the power they have while they're in government. When they are in control of the country, they don't, like, burn down Eskom to the ground. Well, they do by mistake. But they don't destroy the very institutions that were created by white settlers. They actually use those institutions to garner support for their own political party. So how can you say that there was original sin, which is Jan van Riebeeck arriving, but then using all the very institutions that they didn't build to bolster their power in democratic South Africa? It's not a question that he answers in his submission, but I think it's a very important question to ask in the first place.
Look, at the end of the day, this is a submission supposedly based in history, and therefore we need to address this, not as white supremacists and far-right wings, but actually just with history. And if we actually look at history, one of the things that we do tend to notice is that way back when, the Afrikaners didn't allow blacks to build nothing. So the argument that the blacks were actually used as the slave labor to build South Africa and the Afrikaners were just there with the whips doesn't really hold true, because according to the Afrikaner history and according to actual history, what you will notice is that the Afrikaners didn't trust the local population to build nothing. The Nats gave a law which basically said that the only people that were actually allowed to pick up tools and even learn were white settlers, Jan van Riebeeck's lot. So with that all being said, you have to ask yourself, well, what was here prior to the invasion force of Jan van Riebeeck? And the answer is all, because South Africa was largely considered by the Western empires as being a place you couldn't actually dock, in case we all seem to have forgotten History 101. Remember the Cape of Good Hope? Apparently it was impassable by ships. Remember, every ship that went past it was sunk, and it actually took a very long time until somebody actually figured out how to pass the Cape of Good Hope and finally get a ship on shore. Now, when they did get a ship on shore, what they tended to find is that nobody fucking lived here. The Bantus hadn't come down yet, and the local population wasn't really here, and that's why Jan van Riebeeck actually settled. He settled because it was a largely empty country. Little did he know, in a couple hundred years, as he was expanding north, the local population, on the native Africa that is, would conquer downwards, and they would meet and have a big Barney, which we are still feeling the ramifications of today, whereby we just blame Jan for everything and wonder why he destroyed the utopia that was Wakanda. Jan, you've got a lot to answer for, my friend.
Yeah, but he's been dead for absolute centuries. But it goes back to a very important point, I think. It's like this notion that, according to the ANC, and I think Jacob Zuma sort of exemplifies this quite a bit, like this victim culture, like this notion that, a few hundred or a few thousand whites came down 400 years ago, and it's still the sin that we are feeling today. At the end of the day, the ANC, deep down, is just a victim grifting machine. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, we know people in our circles who can trace their ancestry back to 1682, much longer than many native black Africans can, mainly because the Dutch settlers kept records, right? There's no real records on the other side of the aisle here, so they just make up shit as they go along. And by making up more shit, the more they go along, they create a land claim for the entire country.
You know what I find funny is that, I mean, obviously the ANC was originally a very black supremacist nationalist party. They wanted to be more equivalent to Malcolm X than Mandela's vision. But what you do find is that as Jacob Zuma has come more and more out of government, the black nationalism and the black supremacy and the Malcolm X stuff really seems to kind of come out more and more and more. Probably unsurprising that him and Juju keep having tea, yeah?
Yeah, but it's weird. Like Malcolm X was a minority in America, and his views made sense because of how blacks were treated after segregation. In South Africa, mate, you're the majority. You've been in power for 30 years. Why the victim narrative? Because you got nothing else, I suppose. That's the only thing I could really think of. One can imagine that the entire rule of the ANC for 30 years is one based on just pure vengeance, nothing else, which turned into a grift later on. That's the only thing I can conclude. The entire democratic South Africa is based on vengeance for something that actually didn't happen, thanks to this decolonized submission right here to expropriate the whole of South Africa.
I'll take a different approach to that and say I think that until Jacob Zuma's era, everything was probably exactly the way that we wanted it to be. Mandela and Mbeki, not that radical. Both of them tried to follow a Western liberal idea, growing economy. Zuma wasn't really in for it for that. So I'd probably say ever since Zuma's era, yeah, I think you're probably right. The entire shift of the ANC have been nothing more than vengeance. Let us know if you think the same. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, but most importantly, just before we end off, Zuma is very, very considered in this view. He says this submission to expropriate the whole of South Africa must not be viewed as provocation. It's actually a means to finally bring peace, equality, and real freedom in our country. I'm sure that's all he wants. Peace, equality, and freedom.
Yeah, because 30 years worth of BEE, legs up by the states, grants by the state, actively discriminating against any individual that's white, calling white people land thieves. That's not enough to cause peace. Apparently, this is what we need. We need to steal the land back and then build Wakanda. And then when we have Wakanda, we can say Wakanda forever and it will all be great.